Right, good morning, everyone. Nice to have you all online. I'm sure people will come on as we go. My name's Jonathan Crisp. I'm one of the directors of BarnOwl, and I'm very honored and excited for today's presentation, and very happy to have Mark Victor, who's a partner of risk advisory at Deloitte. Heads up enterprise risk management for Africa, for Deloitte. Very experienced, got some great content for you guys today, as well as excellent practical experience. We've also got online Christopher Palm, who's the Chief Risk Advisor of UMSA. Thank you very much, Chris, for joining us. So today's going to be a bit like a presentation from Mark, but also a panel discussion. I think a lot of you guys, people would know Chris Palm has had many years at very senior levels of heading up enterprise risk management at Eskom for many years, but been with UMSA now, heading up the Risk Intelligence Committee, but also very involved with the C-suite, with boards, with promoting risk management, the integration with strategy. Today we still find quite a lot of pushback, or a lot of people still seeing risk management as a compliance type function. So today is going to be a really interesting presentation on adding how risk management adds value, but also how it powers performance. So we're looking forward to your presentation, Mark, and thank you very much for your time, and thank you, Christopher Palm, for being on the panel. We will run the presentation, and then, guys, feel free. Everyone's muted, but feel free to come in with some comments. But at the end, we will also have 10-15 minutes of questions and answers. But you can put in the chat box if you want to put some commentary in there. You're welcome to do that as well. Thank you very much. Welcome, Mark. Welcome, Chris. Nice to have you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for the opportunity to share some insights and hopefully some food for thought. Happy to make it a conversational discussion because I think there's a lot of all of us have experienced the journey so far in the maturing of risk management in organizations, some more, some less mature, but we've also experienced quite a fundamental shift in the last 18 to 24 months with some of the sort of global and local risk impact events. And I think in some respects, as much as it's been we've seen with our clients that it's been a negative shock on the business, it's also really profiled risk management. So yeah, happy to share some insights, and I'm very keen to make it conversational. So I'm going to pick on yourself and Chris for your perspectives, and very happy to take questions kind of potentially as we go through the presentation. I'm certainly not wanting to make this a one-way conversation. Great. Let me just present my screen, and then we can get started. Just need to make sure this is in presentation mode.
We can't see your screen, Mark.
Yeah, it's just now frozen on me. That's the only challenge. So let me just, lovely stuff, hey? give me a minute. Talk about managing risk, the old funny adage.
Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will go wrong.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, I'm just going to quickly open it up again and represent. All right, give me a second for it to open.
Okay.
This is what happens when D6 365 decides to upgrade. Right. So while it's opening up, I mean, I guess what I wanted to share some insights on today is really the continually evolving role of the CRO. You know, if I just look at my journey, my risk management consulting journey, and my experience over the years working with, you know, many clients locally and globally, you know, risk has always been an item on the agenda. It's always been, you know, something that's important. My experience with the banking industry and the insurance industry have clearly been a lot more, you know, reflective of massive focus on risk, you know, but that's driven by regulatory drivers, etc. But I still see, you know, a very sort of diverse range of maturity. And, you know, it fascinates me sometimes, I guess, if I look at the retail sector as an example, traditionally, they've always seen risk as, you know, core to their business, and they run it, they manage it on their own. They don't really consider it to be a, you know, something that's separate. You have the TMT sector, which in my experience has certainly started to evolve to a point where it's very much, you know, starting to mature the risk conversation. Other industries, you know, the ERI sector has very much been focused on obviously some of the critical risks, safety, you know, obviously environment. But what I do think has happened over the last 24 months, in my experience, is it's placed risk, you know, even more so at the forefront of the business conversation. So a couple of, you know, interesting insights for me that I've seen. One is a greater focus and agenda on the agenda of risk in the ExCo, understanding the impact of risk, you know, not just an inside-out view, but more of an outside-in view. The increasing importance of understanding the landscape. I've also seen, you know, some interesting challenge to risk to CROs and risk functions from executives that we've worked with who say, you know, risk is not relevant to me because actually they're looking backwards. They're telling me what I know. They're telling me what's happened in the past. So what, you know, that could be seen as a negative in terms of the perceived value that the risk function and risk management in the organization has. But it's also, in my view, a positive because it's got to a point now where you've actually got organizations recognizing the importance of, you know, of risk management in the reality of what we do as an organization. So, you know, I guess just to Jonathan, to what you mentioned earlier, you know, maybe just a couple of opening points. Some of this, for those on the call, will recognize these as, you know, kind of the obvious, some of the obvious place cards or placeholders in the risk journey. But I want to just share a little bit about some of the insights, you know, that we're seeing and potentially, you know, where risk needs to focus to be able to drive value. So I've always felt that, and this is one of the kind of catchphrases we've driven as an organization, is that risk does actually need to power performance. Ultimately, you know, if we talk about risk at the heart of strategy, the business strategy is about where are we, where do we want to be successful, what are our key priorities and markets, where do we play, how do we win, what are the capabilities we need, and the risk conversation has got to be part of that. And what fascinates me is that in varying levels, we still see the conversation about the intersect between strategy and risk, and we still see that disconnect, you know, just in terms of either risk is not part of the strategy conversation, or it's a separate conversation, or you know, it's ad hoc, just driven by you know, by specific requirements, and when it's thought to be critical or when it's not thought to be critical. So, you know, I think the one of the fundamental things for me is, you know, do we have as a risk function enough of an understanding of the strategy? Does the CRO, you know, is the CRO actually part of those conversations, directly involved in the strategy conversations? What kind of insights are being provided to business in terms of that outside in view, emerging, you know, kind of risk landscape, macroeconomic, all of those elements. What I really like about, you know, I guess the strategic risk conversation more and more, and I'll just use an example of recent engagements with executives or ExCo teams, is that it's actually not about a traditional risk process. It's actually about understanding the current macroeconomic and external environment, and that's a very holistic view. It's about understanding where the business is going, but also where the industry is going, what the long view of the industry is, what the geographic, geopolitical context is, and how that speaks to the global markets and where that's going, and then translating that into a very synthesized view of the critical, kind of risks and opportunities that actually link back to the business drivers. So it's not about rating risk. The risks that you talk about in those kind of conversations are all obviously, the most significant risks that need to be addressed. So, the conversation around risk, strategic risk, and at an executive level, I think, needs to be fundamentally different. It's got to be about outcomes, performance, and, that also then translates into what you're doing from a risk perspective, what are you measuring, and how you can translate that into the impact on strategic objectives, business drivers, value, etc. So, not a new concept, but I still think that there's a lot of work to do. And I still think, in my experience, too much of the strategic risk conversations are still actually too operational. They're not actually talking to the CEO about his strategy, whether it's right, what needs to change, what are the critical drivers and implications, and taking that further. And maybe just the last point on that is that we've definitely seen the increased importance of scenario modeling as a capability. It's definitely something that I think has always been, in theory, a risk capability, but it's been part of the strategy businesses in organizations. If we go back to Clem Sunter many years ago, he drove that and he built out that capability in Anglo American to look at scenarios and where the business was going. I think that's a critical element that the pandemic has kind of brought out as a critical driver and capability. So rather than just leaving the CFO to kind of run a couple of sort of scenarios or stress tests and get a sense of, well, if our labor cost goes up by X, or if our revenue goes down by Y, what's the impact on profitability? We've actually got to take it to another level of conversation. That takes me to the next conversation around capability and maturity. So, the risk and the control kind of link has always been there. It's always been important to be able to kind of understand the risks we're running, and then obviously the critical controls and implications that need to be put in place. But I think there's even more than that. What CROs and the risk function needs to be doing is helping to bring that intersect together of, this is what the organization's there for, this is a purpose, this is its strategy, in terms of what it's trying to achieve. What does this organizational architecture look like? How capable is it? How mature is it? What are the things that need to be in place to actually get it to an optimal level, so it's not over-controlled, over-engineered, but it's efficient enough, but it's managing all of those elements. And I don't think we're doing having a lot of conversations with clients about, have you got the right level of maturity in your organization for your current strategy, for your future strategy, and what's the capabilities that you need? So this is like an operating model and capability conversation. And I think it's a very powerful link to the risk discussion, because ultimately what you're doing is you're looking at risks and opportunities, and you're trying to connect that back to your capability. Maybe just the last couple of points, and I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to brush over quickly. Culture, I don't think has ever, not been important, but I think it's become even more critical when we get to a discussion around operating model. Accountability and ownership, I still don't think is really embedded well enough. And I think the role of the risk function to actually help people understand the risks that they're running and their accountability and take responsibility is probably the most underrated kind of focus. We tend to, in my experience, risk functions tend to do a lot of the work for the business, and rather than actually promoting that accountability and being playing the advisory role. And then the last point, just bringing things together, is I do think that there's still an evolving kind of move towards properly measuring a full risk universe, understanding the connectedness of risk, synthesizing that to be able to understand, these are the kind of risks that will impact on how we grow our customer base or retain our customers or, enhance our volumes. And these are the kind of risks that speak to the infrastructure or the processes. So, on the right-hand side there, I won't go through all of them. What we see as very consistent, flags are, really in terms of flags, are there, what kind of views are there around risk across the value chain? The client, most organizations are in a state of disruption and change at the moment, but that's got to be one of the critical drivers where, I guess you get an intersect, like I said earlier, of either, a function being, the risk function be considered irrelevant or actually starting to add value. And I really believe there's some massive value in being able to drive competitive advantage. One example of a mining client that we've been working with, they've got to a point where they're looking at, some of the deep forecasting capabilities of, commodity price and minerals research in the market, because they see the opportunity to actually understand, some of the critical elements. So, I do think that there's got to be a continued reshape around, understanding the mindset, much more of a business mindset. I don't know, Chris, if you want to just maybe chime in here. I've just spent 15 minutes on the first slide, but good to get your views.
Mark, thank you very much. Jonathan, thanks for inviting UMSA to be part of your panel this morning. So just one comment that, they say what the heart is full of, the mouth will run over with. One of the things that I think, and you've spoken about our role in the board, our role at the board, and I think the one thing that I've realized out of the COVID experience, out of the social disruption experience, and more recently out of the Transnet experience, is that us risk professionals need to challenge the quality of our conversation at board. And why am I saying that? I think we walk away a couple of levels too early in finding the right granularity of the message that we bring to our boards. And I want to use this as an example. And I'm going to link it back to two fundamental, I would think to call it recommendations, how to improve our presence at the board. But let me just unpack the example. So we now sit with a Transnet declaring a force majeure impacting pretty much across the entire country, if not also an international backlash as far as our commitments to foreign contracts go. Be that as it may, I want to talk about if we did a proper stakeholder analysis, and here's where I'm bringing it back to the conversation that we have. If we had a proper stakeholder analysis for our social disruption, if we unpacked the impact of our third-party relationships and we understood what that was, irrespective of the reason why Transnet is down and out at the moment, we would have been better off in as far as being able to respond to this, because we would have had the conversation around the impact of social disruption impacting Transnet, impacting our telecommunications networks, etc., etc. I think we walk away too quickly from understanding our stakeholders, which is, by the way, and I know that I'm an ISO supporter, which is, by the way, the first big job that we need to do, and that is to get the conversation with board to the right level of granularity so that we make sense. And then very importantly, the point that you made, that we link and impact the performance of the organization. So I think that is the first thing. And then I see a comment, Zaid Omar asked the question, and you're going to get to that a little bit later, but just to also add to this, in as far as saying, I don't think we're going to get our opportunities from looking at our risks being threats and opportunities. I think by understanding our stakeholders, which will, by the way, include competitors, it will include competitors, it will include our third-party alliances and dependencies. And of course, when we couple to that, the next step of understanding the context, both external and internal. And if we spend adequate time there, and we then superimpose what we've learned out of that space onto how it impacts on our performance, My take on it would be that our conversations will be value add and of quality, because we will be able to predict and project threats and opportunities on the things that are important for us to achieve throughout our performance. Just a comment from my side.
Yeah, I mean, just maybe closing off and building on a couple of points you raise. I think one of the biggest challenges we face in the risk fraternity, and I'll use an even worse example if I think about internal audit or financial audit, my sort of long distant background, is that we tend to sort of have the wrong sort of we maybe the lens on business. So I feel that business acumen is one of the most critical skills that I think is lacking in in risk functions. And the only way to do that is really to understand, the business at the real level of detail that you need to. So to your point about stakeholders, being able to understand the business helps you to understand the stakeholders, the business drivers, the value drivers, and it really sort of translates into, sort of a more holistic view of things. And then I also agree with you about, kind of the external lens, because if you look at, on a negative note, social media, fake news, there's so much data and information out there nowadays. It's never going to be possible for the CRO to read the paper before the CEO reads it. There's Twitter, there's so many things. So it's just creating the need for, a much more digital focus. And I've got a couple of slides that speak a little bit to that a little bit later. But I think the digital conversation and leveraging digital assets is becoming more and more critical. There's just no ways you can get to everything. And also, if you're bringing those insights and you're getting those insights, then you're able to interpret them. If you're spending all of your effort literally gathering information, you never have the chance to actually analyze. And that's true of a finance function as an example. It can consolidate all the numbers, but if it doesn't have the chance to go and challenge why does that look like it does, then you're never really able to add value. I also, maybe last point before I get onto this slide, to say that, I think there's some evolving, if I look at our sort of maturity models and good practices that we've seen over the last 10 years, 15 years, whilst there's new capabilities that have come in, some of the fundamentals, like you say, Chris, of context setting, etc., they haven't changed. It's actually about how deep we're actually going and what level of insight we're actually getting, or are we staying at a superficial level? So maybe just talking a little bit about some of where we see that what's driving that. Value creation is ultimately what investors want. It's what all the stakeholders want. Both employees, communities. Ultimately, we want a productive society. We want profitable businesses. We want tax-paying businesses. We want to create value. The challenge, though, is that there needs to be a number of different elements that create that sort of context. So understanding the leading intelligence and foresight, making sure you've got the right operating models, you understand the whole business value chain, the culture's right, brand and reputation is managed, etc. All of those things are critical. And what's needed more and more and more is the kind of predictive capabilities to be able to help business actually make and informed decisions. Just picking up, Chris, on what you said about the board, I don't think that any board member ever on purpose ignores, any stakeholder, whether it's first, second, or third line. But the real question we've got to ask ourselves is, are we giving them the information and the insight that's actually making them think challenging things beyond just compliance, so that they actually help to drive performance, you're protecting value appropriately, you're giving them the right level of confidence, but you're also making sure that they can make the decisions about, what oversight's required, the executive can drive the right decisions. And that's sort of starting to, it's not a new concept, but the point is, the question you've got to be asking is, does the current risk register, risk information, give that insight to be able to drive it? So, if we look at some of the elements on the bottom there, and I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to quickly just touch on these. I've spoken a lot about strategy and strategy and business alignment. So that's critical. At the end of the day, business makes trade-offs on a daily basis. It's never black and white. It's never yes or no. It's always somewhere in the middle based on what's there, the best estimate, the best view. What are the competitors doing? What does the market look like? What intelligence are you telling us to be able to drive that? And if we're not able to give that information when it's not, sort of to the minute, then we're not actually helping them to drive decision making. So that's a very hard ask, but ultimately, I think that's one of the outcomes we need to be measuring as a risk function is, are we able to influence risk business decisions, or are we coming after the fact and saying, oh, you can't do that, we've got to correct. Let's rather make sure that we're helping to drive those insights right up front. And, back to the point about the board, same with the executive. If you're able to give an insight that actually helps inform the decision, that's the acid test. Too much of the conversations are about why we shouldn't do something, and rather, why we should do it, but what controls and balances to put in place. Also critical to obviously give the comfort around governance and visibility to the organization. And then, just touching a bit on what you said, Chris, again, for me, the proactive view and the understanding of emerging risks and how they are playing out, the impact on, the assumptions you're making, that is super critical, because the CFO, the CEO, the head of operations are all driving their business. They know what they know. But what about the unknowns? Are you challenging what they know, whether they kind of really have a clear view of it? So, I like the Rumsfeld quote in terms of the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. All of those three areas have to be, kind of considered from a risk perspective. We're never going to, kind of get to all the unknown unknowns. I sort of have a bit of a personal sort of view around, kind of the Taleb's view around black swans. I guess, I sort of have probably a more realistic view of the fact that, there's nothing new under the sun. It's whether we know about it, whether we have a broad enough outlook, and whether we've actually understood the potential impact, rather than, this sort of so-called risk hitting us from the side that no one ever knew about. It's almost easy to say that to your stakeholders when you get to that point of view. So I'm not going to cover this in the interest of time, but I guess what I wanted to just position here is that really we've got to look at all of the aspects of risk. A lot of the process stuff in risk functions has always been there. We can always improve it. We can make it more quantitative. We can make it more intuitive, connected, etc. But I don't think that we've done enough work in the strategy space. Just like the business has got a strategy, what is our risk strategy? Is it aligned to the business strategy? What are the focus strategies that we're trying to drive? That's the most critical element to be able to kind of position things. Obviously, the operating model, I'll cover that now, is also very critical. And I see that emerging and changing, as we go. I think it's going to help the future of risk management, but it's going to make it harder because we're seeing a greater accountability pushed into first line. And then we'll talk a little bit about digital and data. Chris, Jonathan, please jump in as we go through, but I'm going to carry on just to make sure that we don't run out of time.
Mark, I would like to just say something very quickly, and I think I made a comment earlier about less hard work on the risk register and more smart work on intelligence, and that talks so nicely to the point that you've just made on your previous slide. You don't have to go back, but the point that said, we need to be relevant and we need to be timeous. And it's about putting scenarios in place, and it's about putting alternative futures in place that will allow for decisions that need to be taken quickly under complex situations, and more of those decisions more often. But it doesn't help us to be too superficial in providing that information. Zaid Omar asked about should we be part of decision making? I believe it is imperative that we are. That is the value proposition. That's the single biggest value proposition that we have. However, we have to be relevant. We have to look at that block that you showed there. We have to have the right level of information. We have to have scenarios or options available to present to the decision makers so that they could do that. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I guess we talk a lot about the seat at the table, but do we have a voice at the table? Are we actually weighing in. The role of the CRO on the ExCo is so important. It's not a validation role. It's also obviously not directing. It's not about you making the decisions about, do we go into this business or not? But it's being able to, be part of that conversation. I often feel like the second line, the lines of defense view, the second line has actually been too far removed from first line. The reality of it is it's not third line. It's not independent to the point where you've got to keep that independence. Yes, you've got to see the wood for the trees. You have that luxury to not be involved, but you also need to be close enough to be able to understand the landscape. So just talking briefly about operating models, excuse me, one of the things that we sort of seeing as a fundamental shift is, in the last 18 months, we've got to do more with less. We've got to prove our value. We've got to prove the cost that we absorbing. So I've always been a firm believer in measuring the cost of risk, the value of risk. They're not easy things to measure. It's difficult to be able to say, well, we prevented the following from happening when it didn't happen. It's much easier to kind of go the other way. And funny enough, a lot of the engagements that we've had over the years driving end-to-end risk transformations with clients has been when a massive loss happened, or suddenly people woke up and realized, flip, we don't have a view of this. But what I do see is a greater focus on lean governance, agile risk management. So, how do we make sure that we are transparent, we agile, and I think, agile has gained a lot of traction in business. It's sort of foundational to DevSecOps in the IT environment. I think it's a discipline that, for the most part, has probably been built out of business. If you think about entrepreneurial construct, you're ultimately making calls, you're making decisions, you're trying to respond to the market. So what does that mean for the operating model? There are lots of different operating models. If you go back to the bank example, there's a lot of structure. We talk about 1.5 versus line 1.5 versus line 2. The requirements of the banking regulator, the PA, about the independent group risk function versus the operational risk function in the business. That's very, very complex. It's very structured. We've got to look at areas like financial risk, credit risk. But if we sort of step back a little bit and we think about the operating models, and where they're going, what we are seeing is a much greater focus on pushing accountability down into the business, a greater responsibility in first line. So what that talks about here, if you look at the structure, is more of a thin group or a narrow role at the center. What that means, though, is that the role of the group risk function is very pivotal. It's about areas like, how do we do the risk processes? What are the ways of work? How do we make sure we're driving stewardship? What are the capabilities we need in terms of digital analytics, systems, all of those critical elements, and also bringing that strategic lens, aggregation. But it's not about having a massive group of people at the center. It's actually probably more a number of very deep SMEs that are really making an impact. What it's also then translating to is actually going and looking at the role of, business, first line. We've got to move beyond, kind of risk champions sitting in the first line that have a day job and they're doing a little bit of this on the side. They've got to be, kind of have a deeper view. There needs to be a much greater level of maturity so that your sort of risk function can actually play more of an advisory role, a challenge role. So, I think that's the fundamental shift that we're seeing taking place. It also talks in the operating model to, what are the specialist skills that you need to have? So if you think about cloud, cyber, the impact of technology on some businesses, if you think about platform strategies, if you think about the impact of digital, do you have the right skills that of people that are actually really challenging the business? Not, people who kind of understand what IT governance and IT risk is and they're running a risk register, but actually those that can really understand and challenge it. And sure, your operations and your admin have got to be there. You've got to have your systems, etc. But I really think that the operating model implications are really challenging one down from the top down in terms of managing the cost and demonstrating value, but secondly, in terms of driving that accountability and embedding risk into the business and driving performance and structure. I don't know, Jonathan, what sort of perspectives you're seeing from your experience working with organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Look, I mean, we work with a lot of organizations, and I would say a lot of organizations are still not nearly as mature as what we'd like to see them. They still are about risk registers. We've spoken about capability or maturity models for a long time about, not doing risk management in silos, integrating it up into strategy. So I do like what you say, that, and the whole idea of embedding and trying to get ownership for risk management at, within the organization, but also having that group risk function of subject matter experts. I think too many group risk functions are focused on administration, and not enough on actually trying to understand. Maybe, I mean, you can't be a specialist in every area, but what you could be doing is coordinating specialists in certain areas. I mean, I always love listening to the talks on future thinking and things like that. You can stimulate conversation within organizations in particular areas by getting specialists in, even if you're not a specialist in that area, but getting to know the business as a whole, and external context, internal context, as you say, a coordination role, but not an admin role. And it's still far too much admin. And I'll stop now, and also I'm sure we're going to move to it, but not enough being done digitally and electronically. It's still, risk registers are old, they're outdated, they're not being informed with key risk indicators. So I know you're going to get onto that, but, my take on it is we've still got a long way to go, and we know the theory of this, but we're still not there. And my one question would be are there ever any, repercussions, maybe a bit of a harsh word. I mean, how are we encouraging people to take risk management seriously, and what are the consequences of boards and management for messing up and then saying, oh, well, I didn't know about this, and not really taking risk management seriously and getting away with it? I mean, we've almost just had it 2 weeks ago at a country level. So my comment is, unless people feel pain or have some kind of reward, that we all humans, we just carry on the way we were almost.
Yeah, look, I think I can't say there's a silver bullet, because I think it speaks to maturity but I guess what's critical, if you just look at some of the strategy case studies in MBAs, the impact of Nokia, where they went, where BlackBerry went, the question here is, are you in the market, in the right market? Are you sustainable as an organization in the future? How do you make sure that you have as few surprises as possible? So my sort of one response to that, before I move on to a bit of digital discussion, is really, are you having the conversation with the key executive stakeholders that they understand the potential value that you can add in helping them to drive a strong, robust, resilient, effective organization, and they don't see you as kind of another compliance activity? And it's easy to say that from the outside in, but that's the biggest challenge that I see is CROs and group risk managers that we speak to feeling like they need to change, they need to be more relevant, they need to be more strategic, but having the challenge to make that transition. And some of it, is a little bit gray, because it's about having the right conversations and being in the right conversations and bringing the right insights and perspectives, and rather than just running the processes, as we said. So I'm going to be very quick on the next couple of slides, because I'm way out of time already. So as I said earlier, for me, digital risk solutions are critical. What I'm talking about here is beyond the GRC tools that obviously need to be there to be able to understand the risk universe, measure it, etc. What I think is really critical is that just like business is leveraging analytics and machine learning and automation and all of these good capabilities, and even internal audit is starting to look at how they can leverage digital at the core, risk has huge opportunities to do that. So just to quickly talk to a couple of cases, we're working with a couple of clients at the moment, on I guess a solution we call the Hunter. But really the question you've got to be asking is, what kind of tools and solutions do you have in your risk toolbox to be able to focus on specific parts of the business, understand dynamically and continuously what risk exposures are doing. So if you think about a business value chain, some organizations have less of a customer and product development focus. But if you think about customer and product risk, then how are you getting those continuous dynamic insights to be able to understand the patterns of risk, the types of customers or agents or products that are successful, the kind of risk exposures that are there, and providing more real-time insights about evolving risk, whether customers are being lost, etc. Too much of this, I think, is when we look at the risk, is it high, medium, low? Have we got the obvious controls in place? But we're not getting those like real insights. The same goes with infrastructure, inventory, procure to pay and financial processes. What focused kind of digital solutions do you have that are giving you those real-time continuous insights about risk and the level of risk exposure, the key risk indicators, the key control indicators, but more importantly, the key performance indicators? Excuse me. So I think there's a fundamental shift and a need for an additional level of and a different level of risk capability. The same goes in terms of the external context. So, there's some great capabilities out there that have evolved as a result of social media, as a result of, security operations centers and others. But I think that the external sensing capabilities are now no longer a nice to have. You need to be able to understand what are the kind of risks that you're seeing out there. Absolutely, you can do an external scanning exercise, you can manually drive it, but you're not going to get all that insight quickly enough. You're not going to be able to pick it up. If I just use a current practical example as part of the unrest, we've kind of put together a very quick perspective on evolving sort of insights around regional, chatter around, kind of the unrest agenda, etc. If organizations, and I was actually speaking to one of my clients, they saw that coming through in Sunday afternoon before everything hit in KZN, but people didn't listen. Government wasn't able to be responsive enough before things started to happen. So for me, risk sensing is a critical capability that I think we need to be building in. And then just to kind of maybe close off and open up the conversation, back to the conversation about capability. Risk capability, very important, but linking it to strategy, understanding how we're monitoring and driving all of those, but then getting down to the crux, your broader operating model as a business, your systems and data, your people, and all of the processes. Do you have that maturity capability lens? I think that's one of the key differentiators. If you have to maybe challenge, if I just use one example, if you have to challenge the strategy function or the executive on their strategic risk landscape and their strategy itself, are you saying, is the business capable enough? Do we have the right intelligence? Is our strategy process clear? Are we executing? Are we aligned as a business? What are the capabilities that are needed? The intelligence, the assumptions, the scenarios that we need to be able to make sure that we're going to deliver on the strategy. So you can say that, there's a risk of not executing the strategy, but I think it's about going one level deeper and saying, well, what capabilities do we need? How mature do we need to be so we can make sure that we're addressing it? And then just ending off, I guess on the fundamentals, I just feel like we, to the point I think that Chris raised and Jonathan, you said right up front, do we have a holistic enough view of the landscape and the universe Can we synthesize it to the level of simplicity so that the organization can understand it? So if I just, this is our, I guess, trademark sort of risk intelligence or risk universe. We've got detailed risk maps, but they tended to lose people because they're too detailed. If you look at the kind of risk landscape, there's a lot of focus on operations, the typical operation risks, increased focus on regulatory and governance type risks, depending on the organization infrastructure. But, what about the strategy? What about the outside views, innovation, those broader views? And as I mentioned earlier, how much of a customer and sales focus do we have as a risk function? It tends to be one of those areas that sort of, it's a little bit outside of, depending on the industry, where we focus. How much are we focusing on product innovation, design, development, suitability? So, I think we've got to keep things strategic, but be able to get down to a level of detail. And what I think the sort of the last 18 to 24 months has done is it's emphasized even more the importance of the CRO and the risk function to be able to synthesize these kind of views for the business, to get beyond a list of risks, top 10, number 11 is not relevant, to get beyond, kind of, okay, we've done the process, we've got to register, we've got to drive it as holistically as possible. So I'll end there, Jonathan, and happy to I guess take any additional comments from yourself, and also maybe comments from the floor and questions.
Yeah, quick one, Mark. Are you happy to share that presentation? I mean, we normally share presentations, so there was a question. So yeah,
happy to. I mean, I guess my sort of take on things is that IP is now democratized. Obviously, understand that it's IP, but very comfortable to share the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, because we normally do a write-up after this. Carry on, Chris. Sorry.
If I could just add we've that one slide, and I see there was a comment around the risk expert systems, AI and the like. One, and I always like to have an applied view on things. They sound very cool out there, and then when you start doing them, then they sort of get done, but they don't mean much. And so one of the things I wanted to add to all those marvelous points that you've raised is the practical challenge to get that done. And the funniest thing is, it starts with us as risk professionals. We cannot get all the resources that we need to build a proper risk intelligence outfit and all the sexy stuff that goes with that, and building scenarios and the like. And so one of the questions that I asked myself was, how can we put a filter in place that allow us to apply the big data, the big data concept and data analytics, and put it through AI and all of those good things to make sense? Because we can't afford it. We have to be able to choose what is relevant. Yeah. And your whole presentation talks to that, at least in my opinion. The fact that we link strategy to risk to strategy setting and to strategy execution. And the way that we know we're doing well is to link it to performance. And if we then start, and this is where I say it starts with us, because if we then think about key risk indicators, firstly, we'll have an appetite, of course, and we then start developing key risk indicators. I have found that guides us so constructively to be able to ask those people that we collaborate with and those people that we can't appoint, to ask them the right questions around AI and data and what to help us with, so that we could bring that information in. Having key risk indicators, I think, is a very good next step for the risk professionals in the room to focus on, because it makes the elephant just that little bit more smaller and that little bit more relevant when you start bringing in these expert systems to support you. Because otherwise, and this is from personal experience, you just feel so lost. You are overwhelmed with the amount of big data or data that's out there, that you don't know where to touch and where to leave, or grab and leave. And so just a recommendation, to the people in the room that focusing on key risk indicators, which you've also spoken about, is something that we can do to make our data analytics more effective and efficient. And of course, to be able to take scenarios, the scenarios that we've come up with, to inform those scenarios, because literally we come up with a 4-quadrant or a triple sort of approach to a scenario, but we don't know what to do with it after that, because our risks don't talk to that. We can't sort of predict in which direction we're going. However, if you've got strategy linked to performance, linked to your risks, both threats and opportunities, to key risk indicators, positioning them on your appetite profile, it allows you to be able to predict which way the scenarios go that you've said. Just a thought that I wanted to share with you. And marvelous slide back.
Yeah, just building on that. I mean, I think that, you know, some of the GRC tools are quite expensive, and, you know, they have huge value if they mature and they're embedded, etc. What I do think, though, is that there's an opportunity now to be, you know, more agile. Digital is opening up things that were not feasible in the past. Just building, though, on your point about KRIs. Well, KRIs are really just a subset of business intelligence and KPIs. I think we tend to try and treat them on the side. You know, they're the risk indicators, so, you know, they're not relevant to management potentially. I think most organizations have not done enough. You know, for me, I do think they had a critical link back to performance. Risk appetite and tolerance and limits is another link back to performance. So if you kind of really focusing on those, and they also you need to understand the organization in enough detail to be able to get a sense of exactly what what needs to be measured and why it needs to be measured. So it goes back to understanding the business, you know, again.
Yeah, I think just to come in there, I think a top-down approach helps as well. I mean, we've had some experience now where, you know, you could come up with thousands of key risk indicators, you know, in a complex environment. But if you do a top-down approach of what is, you know, so we work with data analytics tool that's integrated with our tool. But, you know, there are thousands of key risk indicators, but, you know, so it's information overload. But if you start from the top of strategy, risks, you know, what are the key areas, then you can start putting, it actually guides you as to what key risk indicators you should be looking at, and actually focuses, because otherwise it can be just overload. You're on mute, Mark. Mark, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Just one last point to add then is, you know, ultimately maybe the acid test is if the KRI is important enough to be part of the core business intelligence of the organization. Because, you know, if it's, sure, there's going to be operational type KRIs potentially that are more focused on, you know, kind of the day-to-day operations, production volumes, etc. But ultimately, you know, the KRIs should be critical and relevant enough so that the diligence of those are included as part of MI and BI for the business. So, you know, I think that the integration of these metrics, whether it's, you know, management, risk, even control metrics, we need to think of them holistically in terms of what we're using to run the business. And that's also, you know, sometimes what gets missed. So if it's not already built in, then the best you can do is raise it when it escalates in a risk meeting or a forum or a board meeting. You know, that's too late. It actually should be informing behavior on a live, you know, on a real-time basis.
I think, Mark, that is the crux. That allows us to be in time. Otherwise, we will always be too late.
Are there any questions from the audience? Cheryl, I'm not sure if everyone's unmuted now, or if they'd like to ask any questions. We're quite happy to stay online for longer. I know it's nearly 10 o'clock, but we'll stay online for any questions.
You can unmute yourself now if you'd like.
Thanks, Cheryl. Are there any questions from the audience? Everyone's...
Jonathan, I tried to respond to as many of the questions. I actually think I've responded to most of them as we were going through.
There's a hand. Okay. Maketsi.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think in light of the risk expect systems that are critical for risk management, artificial intelligence, and I like very much what Victor said about less work on risk register and more work on risk intelligence. I know that the systems may be very expensive, maybe at the moment, but they are quite critical for risk management as strategic tools, because risk is not just a value add on the side. So what should, my question is really, what should risk management do to influence the board to set aside sufficient budget to procure such systems, which are actually critical and required for board decision making? I think the budget issue is quite critical, so that we should not always be bemoaning the fact that we could have done better if we had a budget. Maybe having a voice at the board table, as it was mentioned earlier, to really influence the allocation of sufficient funds for risk management in its entirety, particularly the systems.
Yeah, Maketsi, thanks for the comment. And I guess I've got a couple of thoughts. One is, what I said, like I said earlier, is there enough of a burning platform? I've been part of a number of, kind of GRC tender processes where ultimately there's not enough political will by the executive or the board. They don't see enough value in what's being put forward. So that's actually the real acid test. I guess on the positive note, with the change in digital, low code, no code, agile, technology and digital solutions, probably the best option is to think about being able to demonstrate the impact. So, if you talk about, recording a certain number of critical strategic risks, how do you kind of demonstrate the impact or the value of that visibility, as opposed to, kind of just selling the fact that you need a risk system? It's got to be value driven. I think also there is a chance to do one or two smaller proof of concepts that will help to demonstrate and sell. It's a bit of a sales pitch here in some respects.
Yeah, it's like the chicken and egg situation. What do you have to do first? Because you want to show them your value, but of course you need to, of course, have the resources. So I think just one comment from my side. I just wanted to say that it is a question of stop telling us and start showing us. And the one thing that works from my experience is start off by talking about the impact on performance. Add that to your conversation and people sit up and listen.
Yeah, so very much garbage in, garbage out. So if you can start demonstrating a value in terms of the content that or the whole, your risk universe, then I think you can promote a system. So it is a bit of chicken and the egg, but there's still a lot of, there are good systems out there, but they're not populated well with meaningful information. So that's where Exco and management then think, well, what's, there's this risk management whole gambit is not adding enough value, and it dies a death. I see there are quite a few other questions, and I can see Yvonne. Gordon, I think you might have asked first. I can't really see who came in first with a question here.
I wouldn't know, but let me take the opportunity, Chair, and just thank yourself, Victor, Mark, it's good to catch up with you, and also Chris. I think for me it's not a question. It's just to echo what has been said already. You know, I sit privileged to sit on a few governance committees, whether be it a board or audit and risk. But you know, sadly enough, risk management still does not find space to be deliberated upon. Risk management continues to be seen as a compliance matter. Let's have a risk workshop once a year. There's a risk committee. It feeds to an audit committee, and that eventually gets to a board. And for me, it is to actually say, in as much as we talk sophistication, how I think we need to apply our minds. Yes, we need to present quality to the right table, but how do we begin to simplify it for the board member, for the audit committee and risk committee member? Because when we start to do that, then it will begin to make meaning. You know, we get presented with fancy colors, the 10 risks, likelihood, impact, tolerance, and we argue with tolerance and all of that. But you know, I would like us to really start to find ways of simplifying it, although complicating it under the bonnet. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. So I'm going to move on to another question, and then we could maybe answer, you know, the questions as in one go. But Zaid, you go first, and then Yvonne afterwards. Zaid?
Thanks. Thanks, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks. Now I'm talking through my car's Bluetooth, so
it's working well.
Anyhow, great stuff. Thanks. My past experience, I've worked for Sasol. And in Sasol, we had actually something that worked exceptionally well, and where risk management was an integral part of decision making. So what happens in terms of our governance process? What was the requirement was when you come and present to the value assurance committee in terms of your project or whatever you want, or any decision that needs to be made, you have to show that you've applied, whoever the sponsor is or whoever is leading the discussion in terms of seeking approval, has to have shown that they have gone through a risk process and actually have shown, based on that risk-based decision, the decision that they're actually presenting. And in that way, what happens is then the relevance of risk management becomes in play, because what would often happen, so the project manager would go to the value assurance committee and says, listen, I want approval for this project. And they said, and he will present, these are the risks and so forth. Then the next question would be asked, so have you gone to Zaid and asked him, has he gone through this process with you? And if the answer is no, they say, well, go back, make him, let him go through the process with you, and then you come back to me and tell me how you're managing the risks. And in that way, my value was automatically seen, because now it's a pull factor, not a push factor. So the issue is we have to create within in management and board a pull factor, because board needs to say, okay, if this is the decision you want to make, this is a risk-based decision. How did you come up with this answer? And then the guy said, well, we did this and this. Well, but did you speak to your CRO? Did you go through a process of analytics and deciding that, you know, these risks are actually manageable and effective, and that you've adjusted your strategy based on the risks? And they will say, well, no. So, well, go back to your CRO and get the job done. And that way you start, then your relevance becomes, then they'll say, oh, actually, you know, we need to do this. And in fact, what is the requirement is within boards and CSO and so forth, CRO, CEO, is that decisions have to be risk-based decisions. Because at the moment now, as it stands, is you'll see decisions are made without considering the risks. For example, Treasury will make a decision not to fund maintenance, and that's their decision. But it's a risk-based decision, because if you don't fund maintenance, things are going to fail.
Yeah.
And what we see happening in South Africa is when systems fail, like water structures fail because of lack of maintenance, nobody takes the flak for for not doing the maintenance because of shortage of funds. They say no, the engineers didn't do it. The engineers didn't maintain the system, and therefore it failed, and therefore we need to get engineers from Cuba. So you understand, and that is where, so we need to put the responsibility where it lies within Treasury to make those decisions, risk-based decisions. And that's just my perspective. Thanks.
I mean, Zay, just to maybe build on what you said, back to the discussion we talked about instead of strategy and execution. So another good example I've often find in the construction industry is that a lot of effort goes into pricing deals for bids, understanding the risks, the potential issues, but is that translated into execution? Often it isn't. So you price it, you kind of then go into building you win a bid and you go into building a new building or whatever, and you don't actually then manage those risks so that you actually make sure they don't happen. You end up pricing for a risk, and it occurs anyway and gets even worse because you're not managing it. So it's definitely got to be about, kind of understanding the not just the short term, but the medium and long term implications. And that does speak to, I guess, some of the challenges we have at some of our, within our infrastructure, electricity, water, and a number of others. There's the short term pressures in terms of where we spend the money, and then do we understand the long term reality of infrastructure, rebuild in 5 years' time? Because we actually haven't thought about those scenarios and the long-term implications.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Zaid. Yvonne, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, and thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for a remarkable, insightful presentation, Victor, and the inputs that we've been receiving throughout from Christopher as well. My question would be directed to Victor. In the beginning of our discussion earlier on, we touched on the recent ransomware attack on Transnet and the effect and impact that it has had, and it will continue to have for the broader consumer value chain, for the coming period or so. I want to check with you, Victor, in hindsight, say you were the CRO of Transnet. What intelligence would you have used to pick up warning signals of this catastrophe occurring before it would have occurred? In other words, what do we need to look out for? For an attack like this to happen, so that we would put in place measures to avert it. But as well, as a CRO, what technical capabilities would you recommend for one to have to be able to have, the necessary know-how on artificial intelligence and cyber attacks, and that specific field? To be up to speed with things such that you are able to timelessly advise management and bring it to the attention of management such that it is able to add value and save the finances of your business.
No, very good question, Yvonne. And I think it speaks to a couple of the different capabilities we were talking about, because ultimately, it's a resilience question and an impact question, going back to what Chris said about stakeholders. So, talking to one of my consumer clients that I lead the relationship for in KZN, who works very closely with Transnet, you can see the implications. You had, maybe less impactful issues around spares and parts and components coming in for manufacturing, but you had exporting of, the impact on the exporting of oranges to Europe that has the potential to go and, to rot on the port. So for me, how much of a focus do we have on the shock scenarios or the implications of, of the potential failovers or issues? So it's a resilience question. And have we understood that at enough of a level? Lots of, BCM activities, business impact assessments, etc. But actually, does the board and Exco, does the Pusha as the CEO understand the shock of a cyber incident versus a breakdown in structure or security issue, to be able to make sure that we're able to respond effectively? The other angle for me that starts to speak to your second question is I personally believe that we're not connecting IT and OT enough in businesses. So a lot of effort's been put on IT governance, IT risk, the impact of digital, and in a lot of large, even listed organizations, the operational technologies are not part of that conversation. So you look at the hackers that took down a power station in Russia, etc. It's becoming easier and easier to get into the operational technologies, the manufacturing and other processes. And that's, so are we covering the whole, kind of network, or are there exposed areas? And then to maybe give you my personal insight around skills, I think we've got to be flexible, because to Jonathan's question, we can never have absolutely everyone that we want. We don't want to have 20 people on the bench, a cyber expert, an infrastructure expert. I think the operating model has to be, kind of maybe more agile. Maybe you don't have the luxury of having an internal cyber resource, but then, you should have a flexible model as a risk function that says, I'm going to pull someone from the business. I'm going to pull an independent expert, when I need them, so that they're available to actually leverage. And the same goes with digital. Business is having a tough time trying to look at and keep up with digital enhancement. So, I think that you've got to have a flexible model to bring some of those skills in to help with the thinking and the design. You don't need to have all of those inside your organization.
Yeah, Mark, there was a question from Ashok. Who's ultimately responsible if the company is hacked or held to ransom?
Well, I'd say it's everyone's responsibility. I mean, it's the executives and the IT and the risk, so ultimately everyone's playing a role. Maybe as a quick retort, a sign of lack of maturity is that, you look at some examples, even locally, where the head of audits or the head of risk get fired when there's something happens. I mean, that's a shocker. I mean, maybe if your processes were so bad, you didn't enable business, but, first line is accountable. So, and from what I understand as an outsider, I think a very, very good response from Transnet, Port Authority, to bring all of the stakeholders in, to bring all of the customers in, to engage more broadly and to take accountability and drive the response. It wasn't blaming IT. IT didn't do their job. So for me, it's got to be, everyone's got some responsibility. Otherwise, maybe the other way to put it is, if you're not responsible and accountable for anything, then why should you be in the organization?
Yeah. No, good point. Are there any other questions? I see we've Chris has unfortunately had to leave at the, so we.
I've also got another call that I've got to get onto, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. Well, I think if we will send out the presentation, we will send an email to everyone that's joined, and we will. I don't think we've got everyone's email addresses, but it will go out with a newsletter, and we will make the presentation available on the website, on the BarnOwl website. So we didn't collect everyone's email addresses, so just look out for it on the BarnOwl website. It'll be there pretty soon.